We're here on September 11th at 1 o'clock for a DPW committee meeting discussing curbing and pedestrian right-of-ways and pre-existing driveways. I'm happy to be joined by Councilor Hogan, President Hudson, Councilor Schultz, and also Corey Driscoll Dunham. Take us away and explain how this process works, please.
Great. Thank you, Councilor. So I just wanted to start with some context. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this because I think there's been a lot of discussion, I think, between DPW, the mayor's office, zoning, the law department. We've worked hard to try and make sure we can improve the process going forward. Just to some additional context, obviously there's significant road reconstruction taking place all around the city, more than I think, there had been in recent years, and that's due in part to a number of efforts on DPW's part. Obviously the additional funding that we've gotten from the state, also the sidewalk work that we're doing has just increased the amount of road reconstruction that we're doing across the city, which, while inconvenient, we see as a sign of a growing city. And, hand in hand with the council, we've been working to improve walkability and prioritizing the safety for pedestrians citywide. The municipal sidewalk program was a huge step forward, but we're certainly not done. And so, whether it's, there's been a tremendous amount of work with regard to sidewalks. I hope that the councilors have seen over this past construction, a lot of it revolving around schools, safe routes to schools, and trying to make sure we're prioritizing the safety where pedestrian traffic is the greatest. But again, prioritizing pedestrian safety is an ongoing thing. It's not a one-time, we did the municipal sidewalk program, we're all done. This is something that we continue to do to make it a more walkable city, a more accessible city, and that's, I think, been a clear priority of the administration, and I think, partnering with the council, we've been able to make really great progress.
Before you move on, can I ask you a question about
Sure.
the sidewalks?
Yep.
So what is the width of the sidewalk?
So 5 feet is our standard width. I mean, it's not we have some flexibility there depending on the, the character of the street, but the standard is 5 feet.
I went through the west side, right? Because they're doing sidewalks over that area. Those sure look like 4 feet sidewalk.
Yeah? Which stretch on the west side?
It's between Shiner
Okay.
and Gifford.
Okay.
So just to clarify and add to President Hudson's question, you said the standard is 5 feet?
The city standard is 5 feet, yes.
So city standard, so is that ADA compliance? Is that we decide that's a good width?
So that's 88, you could do 4 feet in terms of width, but every so many feet, you'd have to make sure that there is a place for 2 wheelchairs to pass each other. So rather than making all those measurements, we decided to go, in most cases, to 5 feet, and that way we don't need to make sure that there's a stop every so many feet for 2 wheelchairs to pass each other.
So what happens when a sidewalk, you couldn't fit a 5-foot sidewalk?
So, I mean, then, in those cases, if the conditions don't allow it, then, we have some flexibility there, but the city standard, we work with the arborist if there's an issue with a tree, that maybe there's something that we can do that's more creative, but generally speaking, the standard is 5
So
feet.
you have the flexibility the standard is flexible.
Is 5 feet, yeah, but if conditions prohibit that, then, we do have some flexibility.
So we changed it, right? Because I know previous they had took it to 6 feet. And so now we're back down to 5.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure what maybe DPW had previously done, but I think from the time that I've been here, we've been doing 5 feet.
So the city discerns when to apply that flexibility, correct?
Correct, in compliance with the ADA.
I'm not
Right, no, but I mean,
Or ADA.
right,
But
but this.
so what do you do procedurally then? I mean, do you say, okay, we're gonna, like I'm thinking Avery Avenue, where you have you got between the road and the property, it's very narrow.
So we
what
would-
do you do? You let the ADA know that you're like,
Well, I mean, we would be in violation of the ADA if we didn't make sure that there was a point every so many feet for 2 wheelchairs to pass each other. So say you have a street that has absolutely no driveways. It's just all sidewalk. There's no driveways on that street. It needs to be 5 feet in order to be compliant with ADA. It can't
so
be
the
4 feet.
driveways would help with that determination?
I mean, to some degree. I mean, but again, we're not trying to do the minimum standard here. We're trying to create,
I'm just,
yeah, we're trying.
physically, some areas.
Sure,
they're not
it does
gonna be able to do
provide,
5 foot.
it does provide some relief if there is a driveway every so many feet with a 4 feet wide sidewalk, but we're trying to do what creates the most accessibility and opportunity given the confines of the right of way or the conditions of the street. So 5 feet is our strong preference because that way we know we're in compliance with ADA, whereas if it's 4 feet, we need to make sure every so many feet there's an opening for 2 wheelchairs to
That's what
pass.
happened over there then.
Right.
Because that's 4 feet all day.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the driveways that's making up.
Right, but if there's let's say a car parked over the sidewalk in the driveway that's blocking passage of the wheelchair, you'd prefer to not have to rely on that driveway. So yeah, I mean, pedestrian safety remains a strong priority for the city, and it's an ongoing process. It's not just at some point we'll just be pedestrian friendly and then we'll close up shop and that'll be the end of it. It's just a continuous process.
And let me ask you this, Corey, right?
Sure.
Because I know we talk about pedestrian safety constantly.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we get the pedestrians to be safe themselves?
Mm-hmm.
Because we're talking about wheelchairs, so we're going to stay on the wheelchairs. I see 1 million wheelchairs, good sidewalks, but they're strolling up the street.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we get them to get on the sidewalk?
I mean, there are certainly, and we heard this sometimes with the sidewalk snow removal program, people would say, oh, it doesn't matter if you clear the sidewalks, people are going to walk in the street anyway. True, and if push came to shove, that's a police issue because you're walking in the street and so you're a danger to traffic and you could certainly get a ticket for that. But from the city standpoint, I want to make sure that if that person does decide to walk into the street, that's a choice that they're making. It's not because the conditions of the sidewalk aren't safe. And so, and we'll get to some of this, and believe me, it's a very short presentation. I think we're almost done. But one of the ways we can try to deter people from walking in the street is doing everything we can to make sure that cars aren't blocking sidewalks. And so that forces people into the street. And so, there's not one reason why people walk into the street, but I think from a city perspective, our priority is making sure that if that's a decision that person wants to make, then, again, we could go to the police and ticket that person, but we want to make sure that it's not because the conditions are unsafe.
You're going to get into driveways, obviously.
So
with
these are,
sidewalks.
so these are just some examples, and President Hudson, you can see that example at the bottom. That's an image taken from Google Maps that's available, where somebody is walking in the street and you can see 3 areas in which cars are blocking the sidewalk. And so even if that person chose to walk on the sidewalk, they wouldn't be able to because there are cars parked across the sidewalk. And the images on the top are just some examples of these are the types of conditions that we want to prioritize in terms of safety. There's just, given the dimensions of the property, there really isn't a safe way in those situations for a car to park in a driveway without completely blocking a sidewalk that either already has been installed or will be installed. And we want to try and correct these things as they come along. But again, the priority is safety. That's what is driving the process, is safety. And I think the image on the bottom demonstrates what happens when we don't prioritize, when we have these conditions that create unsafe choices for a pedestrian to try to make.
So
Go on, Councilor Schultz.
is that quantified? Are those dimensions quantified somewhere? Because we talk about a car, we look at the pictures, clearly they're on the sidewalk. We don't know whose car that is, if that's just randomly parked there or not. So where in rezone or what guideline do you use to govern and decide what a driveway?
So I mean, the right of way, so the way the process works when we're either doing road reconstruction or installing sidewalks is that we have DPW staff, and this is the people that work in the field, Matt Fiato, Ed Olney, Theo Derby, people from street repair that walk the areas that we plan to do road recon or sidewalk work. They note conditions they think might pose, some concerns for pedestrian safety. They forward those concerns to Neil in DPW. Neil, most of the concerns that are raised are ended there because the folks in the field don't know where the lot lines are. They don't know where the right-of-way dimensions are. And so, by sharing that information with Neil, Neil can say, look, that's actually not in the right-of-way. That's, their lot goes to this area, so that's not really an area of concern. In this case, when we do see areas of concern, those will be forwarded to zoning to see, hey, this looks unsafe for pedestrians, but if somewhere along the line, did zoning permit this use? Maybe there's something from recently, maybe there's something from the 1950s, 40s that said, nope, the way that they're using this is a permitted use. And in that case, okay, then there's not much more we can do. That's a permitted use. But for the remaining ones where it's not a permitted use and it does pose a concern for pedestrians, that is when we, will reach out to the owner to notify them that, look, the conditions as they exist, in many cases, it's illegal paving, you're parking in the setback, all these things that aren't permitted. We will notify the owner that, look, these are unsafe conditions. And so, we intend to install a curb because the way that the property is being used, is not in compliance, but even aside from that, is not safe. That is the priority, is that they are not, it poses a safety in terms of pedestrians. And so, once zoning comes back to us to give us their information, the process going forward will be that then Neil will share those locations with me because, DPW, this is their area of expertise. And it's my responsibility to balance their area of expertise, their suggestions and recommendations with the priorities of the administration. And so, going forward, those will come to me to make sure that we're striking that balance because we know that these are not decisions to be taken lightly. These have impacts on folks that, it's changing their every single day of where they're permitted to park their vehicle. At the same time, many of these are safe routes to schools.
And with a caveat, too.
Yeah.
That you take parking away from those houses, like on down below, they're probably $20,000 goes off their house right there. $25,000.
I mean,
nobody's going to buy. I mean, these properties right here, they don't look that old. They're probably 1950s, 1960s. But I mean, those driveways were put in. You take away driveways from people, they're going to have trouble selling their house at what it's worth.
Yeah, I mean, and I will say, not that this necessarily matters, but a good portion of these are rental properties. And I know as a former renter, I've been told by my landlord, you can't use the driveway, go park someplace else. And so,
There's been people who won't rent in the city probably if they can't find a place to park.
That's a very interesting criteria to have for renting in the city.
Another thing is some neighborhoods, you take away that parking, and if they do choose to rent from it, they just compete for parking on the streets.
Well, and we can
everybody
create an additional at least one or two additional on-street parking spots by putting up a curb in front of that property. So now we're generating more on-street parking.
One. Yeah.
I mean, this speaks to safe and affordable housing. I'm sorry. We talk about safety. We talk about people that cannot park close to their property. That creates unsafe. And
so you're telling us
it's an 80-year-old woman who now doesn't have a driveway anymore and has to park 6 houses down with her bag of groceries because there's so many renters parking in the street. Otherwise they used to fit.
If everyone has the dozens and dozens and dozens of examples of these situations where it's a owner, they have no other options, like we are prioritizing safety here, and we do take these factors into account. And I will tell you, we compromise and we bend way more than we hold the line.
We shouldn't have to do that if we have clear zoning.
How do you safely have somebody, how do you create a sidewalk in those neighborhoods safely with people parking across the sidewalk?
Walking off the street. She could be just walking around that car and resume to walking on the sidewalk.
They still walk on the street even with the sidewalks and nobody parked on the street.
And I just said, if they choose to do that, then that's their choice. But I don't want it to be because we can't say that we prioritize safety, but we also want everybody to be able to park their car immediately outside of their front door.
And to be clear, I'm not an advocate of parking in the right-of-way. I'm not an advocate of blocking sidewalks. This is a perfect example right here. 805 Highland Street. That's the wrong address. 805 Highland Street.
And we compromised. This is 805 Highland, not higher. And we compromised on this one. We're not installing a curb here.
Okay, they haven't gotten the final word on that.
I was waiting for after this committee meeting.
But again, the squeaky wheel and the special preference, depending on who is the
Right.
loudest, is not a good way to run the city. We need clear guidelines so that when these people go to try to buy these houses, they know what the rules are, rather than they buy something that looks like it has a driveway, and the next month it gets stolen, and they say, but when I bought it, it had it, therefore it should stay. And we know that we can't govern that way.
I find it
So-
interesting that the council's saying the squeaky wheel shouldn't drive policy. But aside from that, what we need to
Well, I
do
believe in
is,
that procedurally, first of all, I let this go. You have a person over in zoning who does research on all this?
Mm-hmm.
Really? Who's that?
Myra.
Hi, Meyer. You
and
just
her-
started
She's
with
a
the city,
she's an
didn't you?
attorney, yes, but
You
she
just
can
started?
she can find the documents. I mean, but again, this is not a process driven by zoning. This is a process driven by pedestrian safety. And again, you
Well,
know,
only in the part that one of those driveways, they might have been approved at one point. And also.
and if they were, then that's information that we
But
have.
also cognizant of the history of the city.
Mm-hmm.
You know, a lot of times, this might have happened before there was even a process. I mean, if you're going back in the 50s, you're going back before the SOCBA even.
Mm-hmm.
SOCBA was in 1971. So you're going back way before there was even, I bet you, even a process.
Mm-hmm.
Or cars, in some cases.
I mean, either we want to prioritize pedestrian safety or we don't. And so, we compromise on these things way more than we hold the line. But if we are going to prioritize pedestrian safety, what this administration believes we should do, and I think the council supports it in all the work that the council has done, both in terms of the municipal sidewalk program and the snow removal program, the council has prioritized pedestrian safety either. And occasionally, in the miles and miles of work that we do each year, occasionally we come into these properties, which I understand they reach out to the council, and I understand it's a difficult conversation. It's one that we are willing to have with the property owner, but we can't prioritize pedestrian safety in some of these situations. There is no way to safely park a vehicle on these properties. Again, we work with property owners to find ways to make it work for them because we understand this is not a decision to be taken lightly, but occasionally there are situations where there is just no way to prioritize the safety of pedestrians and balance that with someone who wants to park their vehicle right outside their house.
There are thousands of legal driveways in the city where people would be at the same the ability to hurt somebody would be the same way backing out of a driveway, whether that car is over a sidewalk or not.
And
I mean,
right.
that happens in the city because you're walking on a sidewalk where there are driveways, and a lot of them are legal, but you're still going to be prey maybe to somebody who's not paying attention.
And there are some situations that we can't help, but there are situations where we can create a safer environment for pedestrians, and this is one of them. We can't always anticipate, driver error or driver distraction, but what we can work on are the conditions to try and promote safety for pedestrians, and that's what we're doing here. And again, it's not as many as I think people think that it is, but again, if this is on a safe route to school, telling students, just walk into the street, just walk around these vehicles and go out into the street on your way to school, I don't think is the message that either the administration or the council wants to send. We are doing what we can in these handful of properties each season to try and create safer conditions for pedestrians. And I understand it's a difficult conversation. Again, we are willing to have that conversation with the property owners to explain to them why. I understand that they might have purchased the property this way, but if we plan to put in a sidewalk, there is no way for them to be able to park their car if it's going to go over the sidewalk. That just doesn't make sense from a safety perspective, and the investment that the city's making in pedestrian safety, we need to make sure, to the degree that we can control it, these conditions don't exist.
So we don't have quantified clear dimensions on what a legal driveway is. Rezone has maximum of 18 feet, but there's no minimum anymore. Is that correct, Mira? If you were moving here from California and you did all your homework and you truly educated yourself on what a legal driveway is because you want to make sure that you understand what you're buying, they can't find this in Rezone. They can't go to the DPW website and find it. It's at the mercy of whoever's in charge at DPW that day and who has the expertise to know what a safe driveway and sidewalk area looks like.
You wouldn't even, nobody would even think that they'd have a legal driveway.
Look at these
Yeah,
photos.
nobody
You're
would
telling
do
me
it.
people can't apply common sense and say, wow, there's no way for me to
My
pull
God,
my.
there's an illegal driveway, the city's gonna take away my
No,
driveway.
but
Nobody
no,
thinks of
you
that.
no.
Nobody even knows what
no.
non-conforming
We are not.
means.
No, you act as if we are walking down the street using a tape measure to see. Oh, you guys are 4 inches too much. We're
Well, it
going to cite
sounds
it.
like it.
These
You
are
s-
no. These are common sense. There is no way that you could park a vehicle safely if you are pulling into your driveway and you are over a sidewalk. Maybe there's an issue there, and that perhaps this driveway is not permissible because all it does is go directly over a sidewalk. I mean,
State
we're-
that in rezone.
this is
No
not red
vehicles
tape.
shall
This is
cover
not
a driveway,
red
period.
tape and bureaucratic. We try to make it as confusing as we can for people. These properties are very clear that
Maybe we could find out, since you're doing all the research, if there's ever been any accident with somebody being backed out over there in any of these.
do we wait until accidents happen to
Well, no,
prioritize
well, you know
pedestrian
what?
safety?
We're throwing it all open, like I guess we're anticipating an accident.
May I
Correct.
address something?
Sure, go
Commissioner- Council members. Just apropos to your comment about the Mayor Hertzberg, I work in the Corporation Counsel's office and work with Jake Dishaw with the new zoning team. 2 items. One is that rezone doesn't have a driveway length anymore, but it does have an explicit provision that says you may not park in the right-of-way. So if you buy a house with a 9-foot driveway and your car is going to hang over on the sidewalk, rezone specifically tells you you can't do that. You cannot park in the right-of-way. Maybe, I don't know what the definition of right-of-way says in rezone, I don't, but maybe that has to be clarified. But there is notice in rezone for driveway length from that perspective. The other, apropos to Councilor Hogan's questions about the research, we have 4 new zoning permitting technicians. They all have a degree in zoning, and they research all the documents that we have. So there are cards for decades that Chuck Ladd and other zoning administrators kept. There are the literal variance documents going back decades and decades. They have the newer system, IPS, that's been around for 10 or 20 years.
These are interns, right?
No, these are our employees who
We have
are,
4 employees doing research on driveways?
they do, every time the DPW are going to do curbing, they submit a list to zoning and ask us to check whether there's any zoning permissions that would dictate that DPW cannot put a curb in. And we check every resource. There's about 5 or 6 resources, and every resource is checked for every single address that DPW forwards to us.
So if all the issues the city faces, we have 4 people looking up driveways.
You're twisting
don't
her
just
words. She
look
didn't
at
say that they're
driveways.
exclusively only researching driveways among the many duties that they do. Either, I mean, you just said we don't have the resources. Now it turns out we do have the resources, but
No, I
it's
didn't
too
say we
many
didn't have the
resources.
I was surprised we had resources.
We
to
do have
that.
resources, and
Obviously,
among
we got
their
4 of them.
many duties
And
that they
obviously, that's a
do,
priority of the administration.
one of the
Driveway check.
to make sure, because that way we can save the homeowner an issue. Because if we find out it's a permitted use, then there's no issue. We don't put up a curb, and we've saved ourselves an argument. So
Price on his house goes down about 40.
I think, well, no, because if he has a permitted use, then we don't put up a curb. And I think it's a good use of zoning's time to make sure that if we're going to do this, that we're permitted to do it. So among the many other job responsibilities that these 4 people do, occasionally they will check the property submitted by DPW to see if the use is permitted.
Occasionally.
They only submit
That is
about
process.
every 2 or 3 weeks or once a month, and the zoning staff, just to clarify, they review all the development permits. They have many, many jobs. They prepare everything for the boards. They prepare a request for legislation for the council. They are very, very busy. But just checking the driveway requests is a small portion of what they do. Thank you.
Back to Councilor Hogan's, if you could stay, Mira, one more question. Back to Councilor Hogan's statement earlier, what even is a non-conforming use? I mean, most people don't know what that means. And it was my understanding, because I did some research, that anything prior to 1960, which was our first ordinance, that was considered conforming. So therefore, that would be non-conforming use after.
Now, there are some caveats to what's a non-conforming use or a non-conforming structure, by the way. I think more often the driveways deal with, well, the parking in the right-of-way is non-conforming use. A house that doesn't allow for any parking might be a non-conforming structure because the setbacks are too small.
So all the ones that you find in
But-
violation are ones that didn't go through the process of getting a permit for their driveway, or what? Or
No, most of
is this
them
something
aren't-
that we're making a decision on in lieu of
We don't make,
2023?
we don't make a decision in zoning, we just check whether there's any
Well, okay, just,
zoning permissions that allow someone to have the driveway in the configuration that it
most of the ones you
exists.
find haven't gone through the process? Are they illegal, like they've never been permitted to put a driveway
I
there?
would say most are not, don't have a permit on record for a driveway.
Okay, and when are they, how would you know when that happened? I mean, if there was no permit, obviously you wouldn't know if they ever applied for a permit, right?
You would have, we have,
Maybe pre-1960, like,
they are, some of them are post-1960, there, a house was built and they
Driveway in
might
there.
have had a site plan that showed a driveway. So it's a mixed bag. There's another resource for going way back is microfiche. We check the microfiche applications. We can check building permit applications.
what was the process before 1960 or 1950?
I don't know, sir.
Was there one?
Actually, the code existed before 1960. I've been researching it all the way back with Joe's assistance to direct me to the council logbooks, but we had zoning back in the 20s, and I've been doing a research project to check.
I wasn't on the council then.
You were just, you
I,
were,
that's not true.
I ran, I
that was
lost.
shortly before, shortly before.
It was before Prohibition.
No, I saw your name. Don't give me that. I saw you in the in the 1924 book. I'm telling you.
I probably voted for the permit.
You did, you did, about 10 of them.
Yeah.
So I'm tracing the zoning code all the way back to the 20s to try to compile a book to show the changes. So it was a very, and in fact, the old codes are in the council books when they got adopted, and each amendment's in the council books.
What I'm trying to find out, was there a permitting process before 1960? Where did you have
Yes,
to get
sir.
a permit from the city for a driveway?
I haven't seen anything specific to a driveway, so I can't answer that question definitively. But
So we can assume that 1950s or so, people just put in driveways when they put up houses.
they would have submitted a site plan, and they would have had a driveway on that site plan, and that would have
And it
been
would have been
checked
approved.
by the building department. Maybe some of them weren't approved.
I mean, there were sections of the city that were developed after
Yep.
1950 or so.
Yep, and a non-conforming use, apropos to your question, Counselor, I always want to say Commissioner, Counselor Schultz. It is a use that existed before 1960, and in fact, before that. The caveat is that it had to be a legal use. So if you look at the zoning code from 1950, and someone has an apartment building in what is now an R1 all residential single-family district, and they abandon it for a few years, that would no longer be a non-conforming use that is allowed to continue. It has to be legal and continuous. Okay, so there's some caveats to it, but not every single thing that existed prior to the 1960 code or the earlier codes is a legal non-conforming use. So we actually, they do other things too, but our staff also checks, right now I'm checking them for zoning determination letters. We check every single non-conforming use that's coming up. And the reason we're doing all of this is to create a compendium of data for council, for the commissioners, for the administration, so that going forward, there's not questions about what was allowed or what wasn't allowed. It's a little bit heavier lift, but Jake and I agreed that that was something we needed to create for the city.
So, just so I understand, so the non-conforming use is by today's standards, right? When you say, when these letters come out, it's non-conforming use by today's standards. You're saying before, we just talked about before 1960 or
No,
1950.
if it was conforming as to an old code, then it gets to stay as it is.
By an old code that might not have existed. You just said that there
No,
wasn't.
no, they existed. I mean, we have the 1960 code, but there was a zoning code prior to that. The code that rezone essentially replaced was a code that was adopted around 1960, I think it was 61. Prior to that, we had zoning codes also. That was just another codification in 1960.
Didn't you say that there was they submitted a site plan, it was approved, and if it had a driveway in it, it was approved, correct?
Yes,
But
some
there was
were.
no specific pertaining to driveways in the code, right?
I haven't looked at the specific codes prior to 1960. There was a code as far back as the 20s when you first got onto
Yeah,
the
got on the
council.
council.
And I haven't looked at the entire code about whether there was a driveway provision in it. Probably not, because there weren't a lot of cars at that time. But they would have captured driveways as time went on, you know, starting in the 40s. And the building, even if it wasn't in zoning, the building would have captured it. So when you submitted your plans for a building permit, they would have captured a driveway that violated the codes and somehow. We did have building codes back then too. So the non-conforming use is for anything, what we're doing with non-conforming uses for these driveways is that if they can fit a car, we're deeming, for residential, single-family residential, if they can fit a car, we're deeming them conforming, or a pre-existing non-conforming use and allowing it to continue.
But when those letters go out, though, then I'm very grateful that DPW did that this year, informing constituents that they're going to be losing their driveway. It would be really nice to have a time frame on there that says, in order to vet that you can keep this driveway, we must prove that you can fit a vehicle in this said area, or else if you don't prove that with this amount of time or fill out this form, then you will have a curb in front of your property. I mean, I watched New Americans right next door to this house that thankfully was squeaky enough to understand their rights to go forward with it, lose their driveway. They were crying. I couldn't even console them because they didn't speak English. So we need to do better, and we need more time.
And we need, there needs to be a little bit more explicit provision in the rezone.
Absolutely.
For, it says you can't park in the right-of-way, but do they know that that's the sidewalk? I don't know if they know, so.
We have our administrative manual that
we
was
can
supposed to
make
help
it-
people understand
Everybody should be
rezone,
quizzed on that.
and it's not in
every
there.
citizen.
We need to make it more explicit, and definitely the letters should refer to the things that we can help clarify people with.
So that is what Counselor Schultz said. If that letter says, if you can prove that you're not that you can park without being in the right of way, I think that would probably solve a lot of our problems.
Yeah, I mean, and we've talked about completely, you know, with a lot of the feedback from Counselor Schultz, revising the communication that we send out, you know, including some images for folks to, you know, because obviously people learn differently, and I know, you know, pictures of what we're looking at, I think would be helpful. And also it's the time frame, which is another point that Counselor Schultz has rightly made. You know, I've spoken with Commissioner Robinson, you know, with the street repair team and the transportation team to say, you know, for, even if it's an imperfect list, we need to have that list, you know, late winter, early spring, so that we can give people enough time to understand what's happening. And again, I do think that through this new process going forward, for better or worse of inserting myself into it, I think we can try to minimize the amount of headaches this has generated for the council, for homeowners, make a clear case of why in the situations that we do decide to install a driveway, a curbing at was being used as a driveway is a safety concern, because I don't want it to, people to get the impression that we're just seeking out opportunities to do this. We don't like doing this, but again, you know, prioritizing pedestrian safety sometimes comes with some very difficult decisions. We compromise way more than I think we hold the line, but you know, I understand it's not a decision to be taken lightly.
Now, I have two businesses on West Genesee Street
Yes.
that are going to be severely impacted.
So the first I can't speak to because they are in communication with the law department, and so I have been advised not to comment on that one. The second one, I thought that we were on good standing with that particular property owner, so I will follow up because it was, you know, first we were going to take away the curb, then we were going to narrow it, and then we were going to put in trees, and he didn't want trees, so we said, okay, we won't do trees, but we're going to do this, and that way you can come from around the side of your property and still do what you would like to do. So I thought that one was settled. I thought we had compromised to the point where that gentleman was satisfied, but I understand from you
The
that he is
gentleman
not.
who owns a small shop on Automobile Row, as it's called, wants to be able to display automobiles.
Right, and the
in front of his
very
place.
generous curb cut I think he has on Eureka would
All
allow
of-
him
all
to do
of
exactly
4
what he wants to
automobiles,
do.
while everybody else gets to display 50, 60 to 100.
So I mean, I thought that one was
I know
settled.
it's weird, but he wants to be able to.
And I
display
thought
them.
that we had made it so that he could continue to do what he wanted to do while not, while still achieving our goals. So,
Certain, there are other streets that would need those trees, he would gladly give them.
well, you know, we've got plenty to go around. Thanks to the council approving our urban forestry plan and ARPA funding for planting trees. There's
You're trying
plenty of
make
trees
up
to go
now.
around.
You're trying to make
But no, I honestly thought that gentleman was all set. So I'm happy to follow up with him if he's not satisfied with the compromise that I thought we had reached.
So what do you envision the process going forward being, or actually 2 questions, what is it now and what will it be going forward? Because I just heard Miara say that they don't make the decision on
Yeah, so
what
zoning,
driveways we
yeah.
keep or not.
Zoning is not the authority on whether or not a curb is put in. Zoning will tell us, is this a permitted use, this driveway? And if zoning says yes, then we say, well, that's unfortunate because we still think it poses concerns, but what can we do? Somewhere along the way, this was permitted, and so, you know, we'll move on. If zoning says, no, this is not a permitted use, then the way that the process will work is that DPW, you know, once they get that information from zoning, will send it to me to try and, because it's my, you know, in the same way that, you know, I'm sure Ann Fordock would maybe envision our sanitation cart rollout to go differently, but we need to marry her subject matter expertise with the priorities of the administration. And so in this same manner, DPW will give me, based on their subject matter expertise, what they think should happen. I will balance that with input from members of the administration to make sure that we think this is one where, yes, we feel confident, we are holding the line here, this is a safety issue. And then, you know, then we would notify the district counselors, any other counselors that would like to be notified before we send the letter out, so that you're aware of it before the constituent reaches out, so that, you know, if we need to have a conversation at that point, we certainly can, but we do want to minimize the impact that this work has on folks while also prioritizing pedestrian safety.
So
You
the
know, we
process-
appreciate the road reconstruction. It's, you know, and believe me, we all get calls about that.
Right.
But you know, it's exactly what that money was meant for, and you're putting it to good use. And also the sidewalk, the municipal sidewalk program. I had a conversation this morning about that. But I mean, you know, this particular thing is, you know, like what they tell doctors, first do no harm.
Mm-hmm.
I don't see doing harm to like long-standing residents of the city who have driveways for a lot of years.
Right,
And
but-
I know there's few
But
and
sometimes
far
that's
between.
at the cost of doing harm to the pedestrians who arguably are more vulnerable than the person who's in a
But
vehicle.
we need that written somewhere so that people understand it. They
So-
don't know they're harming pedestrians.
So I think-
So instead, we just curb them up and say that was harming pedestrians, and they don't understand.
I think you're right. Our communication needs to improve. I think that's why working with Sol, working with Myra, working with DPW, we can better communicate to folks why this is happening, you know, why we're making this decision, give them some opportunities. And I will admit, our communication in the past has fallen short. I will say, I think it's improved over the last few years when there was no communication at all and people would just show up and their driveway was gone. But, you know, sending out these letters has generated a conversation that needs to happen. The issue is it needs to happen sooner, and it needs to be clearer to the property owner of what's happening and why.
So what is the first step for people who see DPW trucks with a line that says hi? Are they to call DPW? Are they to call zoning? Are they to fill out a form? What is it?
So I think we need to have, I mean, if folks have questions this year, you know, they are free to call. City Line is the best place because City Line can put you in touch. Is this a road recon project? Is it one being overseen by engineering? Is it one being overseen by DPW? Is it a sidewalk project? Is it have, that spray paint isn't our spray paint. It's National Grid spray paint. Nothing's happening to your driveway. Like City Line will be able to discern for folks what's happening. But going forward, you know, people should know well in advance of seeing DPW staff walking their street or spray painting that this work will be happening so that there won't be any last minute, calls from constituents not understanding what's happening.
If I may, they can also, any citizen, any property owner can request a zoning determination letter from the zoning department, or the zoning office, I'm sorry, it's not a department. And that letter will detail for them, it'll be the complete history with all the documents attached. Anyone can request it, we get them all the time. So,
How about we do that before we decide our road recon plan? Before we send the letter saying you're losing your driveway, we do that letter, and then we send it to the constituent and say, we've determined this is illegal, you are losing it.
maybe if we got them a little
year
earlier.
in advance.
Yeah, we could do that.
Understood, yeah, we
I
need
mean,
to
we're
get
talking
the,
property values, like Counselor Hogan said, we're talking safety, we're talking DPW plows on the street without even parking, we can't plow. Now we talk about a pedestrian hazard, now we have a whole block hazard, cars can't get down, emergency.
yep.
Can I just point something out also? So if you look at that picture with the red house up there, so they don't have a discernible driveway. And in one instance, we had something like that with a food pantry, and I prevailed upon Neil, who worked very, reasonably with me, to leave them an opening. But they had, the whole block was curbed from one part of the lot all the way to the corner.
It was a drop
So,
curb.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, not, parts, yeah, so
Corner of Holly
they
and Lodi.
needed to be partly curbed in, but he left them a driveway.
Which is
This
great.
house, if they sent a request for a zoning determination letter, what they would find out is that they've paved their entire front lawn to allow basically parking in the primary setback, which is not allowed, so that's what they would hear back. I don't know if they have a garage or where they would park, but I'm not sure that house, absent any prior permissions from zoning, would be able to park in that area.
Nope, it doesn't look like it would be legal to me either. So doing that a year in advance, we're doing the sidewalk study where we're trying to grade all of them so that we know who's first. Let's do a right-of-way study as well and send out informative letters. Did you know that you have a legal right-of-way space? Whether or not you bought the house before or you did that after, it is illegal. It needs to be mediated. We're going to give you some time to do that. Hey, here's some subsidies that you might be able to take advantage of or tax credits that you can do the work. But we can't just go in and curb them up and say naughty and walk away because it's just.
No saying naughty, okay. No, I'm kidding. No, absolutely. No, you're absolutely right. The more advance notice we can give people, the better. That's absolutely what we need to do. I do
A lot
not
of folks
disagree.
really don't know, because when I bought my house, my driveway was like that.
Sure.
When I purchased it, so.
And we do, to Myra's point, we do try to work with property owners. There are just some conditions where there's just absolutely nothing that we're able to do.
But that's the property owners. I would guess that it's maybe 10% that even have the wherewithal. I was so impressed that this constituent knew enough to call her counselor to say, what do you know about me losing my driveway? And I'm like, I know a lot.
Yeah,
Thanks
she
for
knew enough to
calling.
park over the sidewalk too, so we couldn't do any work. So that was,
Counselor Schultz almost laid down in that right of way, so thankfully Rosselli was kind enough to
talk
keep
about
walking,
safety.
because I was
Yes.
going to trip and accidentally break my ankles so that they didn't do
Yes.
what they did to the person next door. And thankfully, because they can fit a car nice and neat in that area.
Well-
And it's been there since well before 1955, as we can tell from the pictures and the
well,
proof.
her next door neighbor
So-
might have an issue because she's parked on their property, but that's their issue to resolve.
Well, it is their issue to resolve, but doing that zoning determination letter a year prior would be great. However, that's a civil issue, it's not a city issue, so we all know that
Understood.
too.
So if we're not, the car isn't interfering with the right-of-way, they're okay.
I think that's generally what the place that we'd like to get to. And working with Myra and DPW, I think we can get there to a place where it's much more reasonable. But Myra's about to tell me I just said something wrong.
I just wanted to say that. This is so loud, or I am.
Why not?
Stay back. There's also a fire safety concern, so that is a really funny example, that 805 Highland. I hate to bring it up and open that can of worms up, but their egress goes right in front of their driveway, no matter how old it is, sits right in front of their
Entrance.
only egress to the house. So if they had asked for a zoning determination letter, they would have been told that they can't park there.
So who makes that determination based on fire hazard?
Well, it's in the New York State Property Maintenance Code that you can't block with anything the egress to a house. So we don't make that determination. We just review the code. We confirmed it with the fire chief to make sure that we were reading it the way they read it. So in that kind of circumstance, and there's plenty, not a million of those houses, but there's plenty of those kind of houses with the, and she happens to have a very narrow lot. So there's no
Those
room on.
north side houses,
It's
yeah.
non-conforming lot, so there's no room on either side to put the driveway. But, so it's not just what Corey said, but it's also
But our
the
fire department,
code.
when I called, they said they don't get involved in driveways or
They
property
don't,
safety.
they don't, but whether or not they get involved, it's still the fire safety
Right.
That's
prevention
valid,
code.
but it doesn't exist in rezone. And if I'm looking to buy a house in the city of Syracuse and I want to fully understand what the property guidelines and rules are, it's not in there.
Well, because it's in the New York State property, so it's not going to be in rezone.
It needs to be in our administrative manual. It needs to be in some kind of document that the general public can easily access.
I'm literally drafting some amendments to rezone right now to address some issues that various counselors have raised. And one of them is to beef up the driveway section to allow people to know more about what they can and can't do. And I think those issues with a driveway sitting right in front of egress is going to be seen on a case-by-case basis. But a zoning determination letter would tell them, A, you don't have a driveway. Where DPW goes with that, I don't know, but I'm just
We need to
telling
be
you
in
that
touch with each
the
other
letter
because-
doesn't mean you're home free. The letter would just tell you the status of your property. Was there a variance or some kind of permit issued, even a building permit or a certificate of occupancy issued that addressed that driveway? The food pantry had a very oblique reference to a curb cut in front of what they now use as a loading dock. And that was the basis with which I convinced Neil to
Thank you for
allow
that.
them to keep the curb cut, and he was very gracious and did it.
He was, thank you, Neil.
So,
Got another one up in the West End, too. So.
yeah, so the letter doesn't fix the problem, it just identifies the situation. But there are other
And it's more-
considerations.
Direction for people being taken care of properly rather than being robbed.
Right, so we can transmit those letters to DPW once we start this new system of getting them for each property that is going to be subject to curbing.
Just do have one question. If you can give Corey the picture so I can just.
Has it in her email, but sure. Sorry about the typo.
No, that's okay.
So the bottom left picture there.
Yeah, nothing's going to happen. That
No,
yeah.
this is not in relation to this property at all.
Yep.
Is there any other properties that we have throughout the city that may have had a high curbing put up, and maybe the parking lot or the driveway has been removed?
I mean, none of them have been put up in error. You know, none of them have been put up in a way that, oh, we did what we weren't supposed to do. I think what it comes down to is prioritizing which ones we think pose, you know, a genuine safety. I mean, you know, technically, I think you're not supposed to technically park your car in front of your garage. You know, technically, you're not supposed to do that. We're not, like, that's not a safety issue for us. We're not going to prioritize that. Like, if we wanted to, you know, hold people accountable to every single, you know, dot of the law, I'm sure we could, but, you know, we haven't curbed anybody up that, oops, like we did that in error. But it really comes down to prioritizing. And that, again, is where the buck stops with me, prioritizing DPW subject matter expertise with the priorities of the administration.
The rest of the driveway would be filled in with like grass or something like that.
I mean, ideally, I don't think this property owner plans to do that, but
But not this one, but I'm saying.
yeah, but that would be ideal.
Gotcha.
Yes.
This property owner, you said you were going to tell us after the meeting, the good news that they were actually going to retain what appears to be a
Yeah,
adequate
good news
driveway.
is a relative term, but yes, I plan to share with her an update on her driveway situation.
Is the rest of your slideshow as well? Or?
That's it. That's all I got. I've learned to keep them short.
Another question about the use variance application. Does that apply here with driveways?
Not really, and that's my own error. You know, the requirements for a use variance, I think and Mayor, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think setting property owners up to think that you can get a use variance to try and allow in these types of situations, I think is misleading, and that was a misunderstanding, I think, of what had happened historically. But now that zoning is more within our wheelhouse, I don't think a use variance is really the right thing to advise people on, because the criteria for a use variance is very specific, and I don't see it applying in most of these situations, and I'd rather save people their $250 and the hassle of going through it. But again, that's why I think we need to prioritize and make sure that when we are doing these situations, that hopefully there's not many of them, but that there is a genuine safety concern. And if there is a genuine safety concern, I think that makes the likelihood of getting a use variance even farther away.
Use variance application fee should be $25 because that's what the old zone was. And with rezone, it says any changes to fees shall come to the council for approval. So if we're charging $250, we need to stop doing that because we don't know who set those fees. Madam President, are you aware of any fee changes since old zone?
They were they not in the code when it was adopted?
No, because the council was supposed to approve any change in fees.
yeah,
We didn't
I know.
address fees. That was supposed to go in the administrative manual, which was the next step. But
I thought you were going to ask a question about use variances, but definitely it is not the vehicle to try to solve one of these driveway problems.
Okay.
I spoke with Corey about it last week, and I think because there was just a miscommunication that because zoning checks were done to see if there had been a variance, which wouldn't have had anything to do with the driveway necessarily, that she kind of conflated that to, hey, the vehicle here is a use variance, but it absolutely is not. And even their $25 would likely be wasted if they were trying to get a variance to address the driveway issues.
yep, good to know.
Thanks,
Now
Mayor.
we're clear.
No further questions at all? Thank you all for being here today. This
Thank you,
concludes the meeting.
counselors.
Thank you.